Every Mother's Day, we buy gifts for our lovely moms and take time to honor them. But does modern society still hold motherhood in high esteem, or has this maybe diminished somewhat as a calling? To discuss this in more detail is Noelle Mering. She's a mother of six and the co-author of The Theology of Home, the Spiritual Art of Homemaking. Noelle joins me from Ventura, California. Noelle, welcome to Bridge City News.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
Now, how has the perception and the role of a homemaker really changed over the decades, in your opinion?
Well, I think we get a hint of how much has changed just with the word homemaker. I think most people bristle even at the mention of that word. It sounds like something maybe archaic or something silly or something that you do when you can't maybe hack it in the real world. At the same time, I think people understand have a renewed understanding on how important home is. So we've returned to a lot of domestic crafts like making bone broth and having a garden, planting food in our backyard or knitting even. But we haven't quite connected the dots between the importance of these things and the importance of the person who's caring for the home. And we've all been in our homes so much over the past year because of COVID that I think a lot of people are trying to maybe re-examine and reevaluate how their home life has been functioning, how healthy it is, how much it's flourishing or not, and maybe making adjustments here and there. So the homemaker, though, is a key part of that. And, even if in some ways anyone who lives at home, whether you be professional or a man or anything, in some ways we all are in some sense making a home or called to, even if it's not full time. But there is a real dignity of the job of doing that full time that I think we've lost respect for, and we need to reclaim that.
So, what is your message to moms who are not able to stay at home full time with their children?
I think my message to them would be the same as to any woman, just that you have a great dignity in what you're doing, even if it's not full time. So, a lot of women are in a predicament where they can't, and they deeply desire to be home more. And that's one of the unspoken things that I think we don't really think about in societies. That we're constantly thinking that that the preference is to be working. Well, there's a lot of working women who wish that they could be at home, and to start thinking in that way that that this is something that oftentimes we desire more than we're willing to admit. But for working women, my message to them was just to, you're probably trying to do a lot, you're balancing a lot, and it's going to be hard. You're going to do it imperfectly, as we all are, and to give yourself a lot of grace and keep trying to put that best effort, day in and day out with a good optimism and good cheer, but also a lot of grace for when it doesn't all come together.
Now, your book is filled with some beautiful pictures, encouraging quotes, and stories from women. Who are some of the women featured, and what are some of their powerful messages?
Well, we have a great variety of women. So, from a young mom who just had her first baby to a professional working mother of nine who's an architect to a dear friend of mine who's actually an ER nurse, and is trying to be more of that working mom who longs to spend more time at home. And then we've got a stay-at-home mom of eight children, a grandmother, a single woman who has not had children but still feels this call to be fruitful. And our message throughout this was to show that it's the common thread throughout these women is not that their lives look exactly the same or that their circumstances are the same, but rather that they're all striving to take and respond to the circumstances and the calling that God is a life that God has called them to, and respond with a yes and an embrace of that life to serve in a spirit of service and a desire to really be fruitful in cooperation with his plan for what he's got going on for them. So that was the common thread in all these different lives that I think we as women need to and can remember, and that we have this great capacity to really serve people around us. Um, and I think that's been lost in a lot of ways.
Yeah, Noelle, you write in your book that culture traded fruitfulness for power and control. Some may wonder if you're actually saying that a woman's fruitfulness is exclusive to fertility and nurturing.
Yeah, no, no, we're definitely not saying that it's a purely biological sense of fruitfulness. It rather is it has a deeply spiritual connotation, and we really use that in a theme throughout the book. That there is this way in which women have this capacity to receive others in our prayer life, into our homes, as mothers and welcoming babies. But also that we have this ability. It's connected to our ability to our instinct for fruitful relationships. That we want to not only receive people, but to encourage them, to nurture them, to make them have better lives, to help to be tender, to help heal their wounds, and facilitate God healing their wounds. So, I think there's a deep desire in women's hearts But we've had this metric that our purpose is not this sort of thing, but rather a metric of power, that we are supposed to be powerful, and that's our goal. And I think one of the things we dig into is the fact that women are powerful. It's a fact, but it's not our purpose. And that's a very different setup if you think of it as your purpose versus just a fact of your life. Because once you make it your purpose, you become induced to a lot of anxiety, your competition, comparison, all these sorts of kind of ill feelings that are the sort of rotten fruit of making power your purpose.
Many moms obviously worry about their children, doesn't matter what age, whether 2, 3, or even 23 years of age. You believe that while worry can offer a defense against the trials of life, it can also create jealousy and envy. Can you explain?
Sure. Well, I think, one of the things we dive into is the fact that worry has a similar, it's similar to contemplation on the surface, but if you dig into it, they're actually quite opposite of one another. So worry is sort of a sense of trying to control a situation. If I think about this problem and all of the possible ways that things can go wrong or get worse, that somehow by thinking about this or obsessing over it, I can kind of contain it and keep the bad thing from happening. But we know obviously that's not true. And contemplation rather is to take it into our prayer life. So we can take that same problem and think about it, but think about it in a way that we're surrendering it to God, and we're pleading to Him to guide us through this, with a trust that He can. And so rather than containing it, controlling it, we're really opening ourselves up to God's will in regard with whatever that might be, and stepping out in faith and trust in His plan for us.
Many moms like to compare themselves to other women for their accomplishments and the ability to multitask. Why should women remind themselves not to really get caught up in that?
Yeah, I think that is a problem that's so exacerbated today, obviously, with the advent of social media. Everyone's susceptible to it, and I think it might be a lifelong struggle for most of us women. But I think it's really it's a waste of thought and a waste of time to put energy into comparing ourselves. There's always going to be someone more beautiful with a better house, with a seemingly happier marriage, or better vacation or something, you'll never arrive to the end of that struggle if you keep focusing on it. So one of the ways that I think we can shift in our minds away from that is to redefine ourselves, that our value is not based on the affirmation of other people so much as it is based on being daughters of God, of a loving Father. And that's where our dignity comes from. That can really root us and ground us.
Now, you really explain in your book that a woman becomes who she is meant to be by drawing closer to God. Can you elaborate on that a little?
Sure. I think, if our fundamental definition is in connection to Him, then it is in uniting ourselves to His will, coming closer to Him so that we might be able to reflect Him, in which we become more ourselves. So I think oftentimes people think that a relationship with God will sort of like subsume your personality, or you won't live your true self. You won't, and that's a very modern notion that we need to be individuals based on, this expression of this very unique, something inside of us. Well, that expression of a unique identity really comes through that fact that we're irreplaceable in his eyes, that He loves us as particular individuals in a familial way. And I think that's where we find that sort of irreplaceability. But it's not through making sure that we're expressing ourselves in our unique identities in ways that are really affirmed and seen by others. Rather, it's that we are, in becoming closer to Him, we're able to love more. And sin makes us boring. That's the thing that I think, we don't realize. Sin actually is a flattening of the human person, whereas grace is actually a fulfillment of the human person. And that's where our focus could be.
The role of a mom oftentimes involves a lot of serving, and many hold their children a little too tightly, which becomes more exposed as children get older. Why is detachment to our children necessary and the best thing for our children?
Mm. It's such a good question. And one things we're trying to figure out is, that there are two extremes that parents can fall into, and mothers maybe in particular. Either too neglectful, although that's more rare, but the more likely extreme is that we become too controlling, or that we use our children almost to serve our own egos, or to reflect us into the world in a way that's positive. And I think we all know that real leadership and real, whether it be through the father or through any parent, is going to be for the sake of empowering that child to actually go out into the world with confidence and courage, and making their own decisions, and able to rule themselves rather than be ruled by outside, externally. but it's creating children who can, it's ultimately, we're working ourselves out of a job. We're mothering them so for the sake of the fact that eventually they won't need to be mothered. And that's it's a sadness, but it's a sign of the transitory nature of parenting, but it is the best way to really be a loving parent.
That's been the biggest thing for me too as a father with my two children is just to let go and let God and let them. Sometimes they fall flat on their face. They're like, don't go down that path. I've been down that path. It'll lead to destruction. They're like, I'm going down that path. All right, you got to be hands off and just let them learn on their own, I guess, right? And that's a real challenge as for mothers and fathers.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. It's hard. You want to play God in a way, just say, I know what's going to happen. I know, I see the future. But, as you said, they have to come to it, their full freedom. And once they come to the good, choosing the good things out of their full freedom, they'll embrace it more deeply, than if it's kind of pushed on them or, coerced upon them.
Now, Noelle, you're right that we all have a fundamental desire for community. Even the busiest of moms can struggle with loneliness. What's the big difference then between isolation and solitude?
That's a profound question. I think isolation it connotes something negative, whereas solitude it's something active that we're choosing. And moms have a hard time getting that solitude or that silence that is so necessary for important to foster a prayer life. And you can feel as a mom sometimes that you just are nonstop being touched or there's noise going on everywhere, and it's really hard to find that silence. And so, we talk about trying to foster, even as busy moms, interior silence in our soul, so we can, even despite the chaos, kind of retreat into just for a moment and connect with our Lord. And we can do that in really physical ways with the mundane work of the house that, as I'm washing the dishes, I can say, we are washing the dishes, Christ is with me in this, even in this, and the folding of the clothes. I can say a prayer for the person who's going to wear that clothes. I'm going to say a prayer now for my son as I fold his shirt, or for my husband. Um, and these are great avenues, and I think that's really the spirit of theology of home, is that we're recognizing that it's through the material world that the spiritual world, we can connect these worlds. We're not meant to be disembodied. We have bodies. Christ came and he's an incarnate. And our lives too are reflections of that as well. So how we bridge these two worlds, our material world and our spiritual world, and the daily tasks of life. This is a really beautiful opportunity for us, and one that I think we shouldn't take lightly or think is unimportant.
Some people feel that when we become lost in life, that's when we most yearn for home. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that's a universal longing. And my co-author Carrie Gress, when we wrote our first book, Theology of Home One, the subtitle is the Finding the Eternal in the Everyday. She was listening to a song about a homecoming, and it really struck her. We all just love homecomings. We see soldiers coming home, being reunited with their families, or homecomings, or in children, adult. The prodigal son, he comes home. These things are powerful and evocative, and I think it's because home really is this foretaste of heaven, where we can belong, where we can feel safe, where we're valued just for who we are, not for what we can do for someone, or in a utilitarian way. These are all what home can point us to, and it speaks to the deepest longings of our heart, and ultimately is a whisper of what heaven, I think, will ultimately be like.
So, Noelle, any final thoughts on the best way of honoring our moms?
Yeah, well, you could give them Theology of Home, the book, but the best way of honoring our moms, I think, is just to recognize, really spend some time. Just in anticipation of Mother's Day, I spent some time thinking about my mom and what I've learned from her. And on our website, theologyofhome.com, actually, I'm publishing an article today about with different women and what the best wisdom that they learned from their moms. And I think that's a nice Mother's Day present that they can all share, that we've thought about and really considered what we learned from them. Mothers love that, and I think it can be as simple as that. Maybe written in a card, or talked to, spoken to her over brunch or over a phone call. I think that would be meaningful, and it really reflects some deep consideration too.
Noelle, thanks so much for joining me today from Ventura, California.
Thanks for having me.